And yeah, so to say hello again to this first workshop in a series of two, at least so far. We have planned with 2 workshops around the idea of toolkits, particular toolkits that are focusing on mission-oriented innovation or challenge-oriented policies, however we want to call them. And I think that the reason for that is relatively straightforward. I think we see a lot of governments that are experimenting with mission-oriented policies, but they're also finding it actually quite challenging to implement these policies, or both design and implement. And so what we see is an emerging field of sharing practices. So we have government organizations or organizations linked to government organizations that are putting out various toolkits, how they did it or how they're doing it in terms of practicing mission-oriented innovation policy. And so our idea, and of course, this is the toolkits are a way of trying to formalize or at least put into some sort of abstract way of what organizations are doing, so that this can be shared with other organizations. Other organizations can learn from that, and also, of course, modify. And so hopefully this is what happens out there in the field. But what we are trying to do today here, and also in the next workshop in a month's time, is to gather together some of those practitioners and actually look at the different kind of toolkits and or playbooks, as they are also called sometimes. And so to look at what is out there and what are the common elements to them, and what are the also the interesting differences, because in different contexts, organizations might need different kinds of toolkits. So this is really meant to be a sharing exercise. So this is a workshop for MOIN members predominantly. So you're mainly here because you're part of MOIN. And so this is, as MOIN is meant to be this peer learning space, so we try to keep it this way very much today as well. And today we start out with a brief presentation from Anna Colgan. She's a MOIN research fellow, as we might call her, I think, for most properly. So she will talk briefly about her work around sort of looking at the toolboxes and toolkits around the world, really, and offering you a bit of like a typology, and also the bit of a reasoning why we have these two sessions organized the way we have, why we have invited people we have invited to speak, because hopefully they are speaking from very different types of toolkits. That's the main idea. And after Anna, we have 2 presentations, both around 15 minutes. First, Dan Hill from Melbourne School of Design, formerly Vinnova in Sweden, and he will talk about the practice that he developed in Vinnova, and the toolkit, the playbook they have put out. And after that, we have Ralf Lindner from Fraunhofer, and Ralf will talk about the toolkit that Fraunhofer put out for mainly, I think, for the German context, but of course there's also a much wider implications for toolkit as well. So again, these are very different sets of toolkits, but I think hopefully that'll lead to interesting discussion as well. And after that, we have a discussion with the presenters, but then we also want to do a bit of a breakout sessions to discuss also your experiences with toolkits, so that you can bring your experience as well. And I think we will also, as we go along, ask you to use the chat, and we have some Slido exercises prepared for you as well. So we gather more information, and you can also give us input in terms of what you are doing, what kind of tools you're actually using, what you find useful in your practice as well. I think that was everything that needed to be done in terms of introduction. I think Anna, Nora, did I cover everything? Hopefully I did. And yeah, I'll try to keep the session going. My name is Rainer Kattel. Also, of course, I forgot to introduce myself, but I think we are so used to reading our names from the Teams windows. So hopefully nobody was bothered by not knowing me. Anyway, I did the introduction, and now I hand the floor to Anna for a brief overview of the work she has done so far.
Thanks very much, Rainer. So yes, as Rainer said, I'm going to give a bit of an overview into the analysis that we've done on sort of policy tools and toolkits, and hopefully it will help to contextualize both this session and the subsequent sessions in the tools learning series. So I'll start by just giving a sense for the scope of the analysis. So it's centered on these three main pillars, and I'll speak to each one briefly over the next 5 minutes or so. So the first has been around internal scoping. So we've been looking at, what tools IIPP has already developed, what are our methods for doing so, and what our future priorities might be in this space. We've also been looking at the external landscape, and in a sense, that's the focus for today. So understanding what tools and toolkits already exist, especially in terms of kind of mission-oriented innovation, but in policy sort of more generally. And lastly, we've been looking at practitioner needs, so trying to understand what the operational context and needs of practitioners, so those practicing mission-oriented innovation, are in terms of tools, and where the kind of gaps and future needs might be. So in terms of the first pillar, this is kind of more reflexive one, looking at our own tools and sort of trying to curate those and present them in a sort of practitioner-focused way. So in this slide, I've just given a snapshot of the types of tools that we've been looking at. So we've got a few around the side. So in the top left, we have our missions map, the MOIN casebook in the bottom left, which many of you might have seen. We've got our kind of prototype framework for value creation, which was developed as part of the IIPP BBC report, and the missions beginner's guide. So these are examples of kind of what you might call tools. But what I want to draw attention to is the image in the center, which is a preview of the contents from our sort of MOIN resource guide, which I think many of you might have seen as a pre-read to the MOIN gathering. And this was really a kind of first attempt to systematize and collate a lot of the tools that we're producing in IIPP, a lot of our publications, and present them in a systematized way for a kind of MOIN audience. So this is not a toolkit as such, but I think this was part of our kind of work to collate and curate tools in a way that's, as I said, sort of practitioner focused. And we've been using the raw framework as a sort of framing for those tools. So that's our director, Mariana Mazzicato's framework for innovation, market shaping innovation policy. So just moving on to the second pillar, we've been kind of looking at the landscape in terms of tools and toolkits, both for mission-oriented innovation policy specifically and policy toolkits more generally, with a view to understanding the various formats and methodologies that go into the generation of these toolkits. But on this slide, what I've shown is a sort of overview of some of the key toolkits we've been looking at in the mission space. Obviously, we're going to be hearing from two today, from Fraunhofer and Vinnova. And then next time in the series, we're going to be hearing from two more. So we'll be hearing about Cicero and Demos Helsinki's toolkit, toolbox, playbook, however you want to call it. So in terms of the landscape mapping, one thing I want to draw your attention to is the toolkit typology that we've been developing. And this is really a way of trying to make sense of what we're seeing in the landscape. So what we've done is try to extract some kind of key categories that we're seeing in the toolkit space. So these are by no means mutually exclusive, but what we found is that, most toolkits tend to fulfill at least one of these functions. So at the top, we have the kind of collation style functions. So these are more things like resource suites, libraries, depositories, which are very much focused on curating and organizing resources into one easy to navigate place. Then we have guides, manuals type of toolkit. So these toolkits tend to be more focused on systematization, so converting theory, knowledge, and tools into a systematic process or set of key components. We have casebook and playbook type of toolkits. So these tend to veer kind of more towards exemplification, very focused on offering examples. And then lastly, almost turning into kind of the e-learning space, we have courses and sort of skills builders, which are very much about teaching practitioners the types of skills and techniques you might need to carry out specific activities. And we've put a couple of examples here, not, as I said, not mutually exclusive to each category, but more toolkits that we think, might especially exemplify that particular function. So moving to the last pillar, before I hand back to Rainer, this, as I said, has been very much focused on practitioner needs. So we've been trying to understand, first of all, what the contexts are in which people are using tools, what the types of tools are that practitioners are using already, and then looking to the future, where the gaps might be and where there's demand for future tools in that sense. So this is a snapshot from the MOIN survey, which many of you might have filled out. So thank you to everyone who did ahead of the MOIN gathering. And I think this gives a sense for some of the context in which tools are being used. So I won't sort of go through the slide in too much detail, but I think it was interesting that we have a very large proportion of people focused on implementation, because that obviously says something about the types of tools that might be needed. There were some common challenges in terms of carrying out missions, designing missions. So we had things like engaging stakeholders, navigating bureaucracy, getting buy-in. And then we also asked about existing tools. So you can see quite a broad range of, I guess, typologies and formats like policy frameworks, online resources, theory of change, data sources, etc. And then lastly, we did ask about future needs. And interestingly, sort of in the typology, it was quite evenly spread in terms of the needs that people identified as important in terms of future tools. So with that, I'll wrap up and hand back to Rainer to introduce the first presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anna, for this excellent summary. And indeed, as you see there, our idea is not to discuss which one is better or wrong or worse or what have you, but actually to see the landscape out there of all of those various toolkits emerging, because they are, I think, a sign of organizations trying to work through what does it mean to build challenge-oriented, mission-oriented policies. And that is an interesting learning. So I think what I forgot to tell you is that you can introduce yourself in the chat as well, so people get to know who's actually in the room. So I'm sorry about that. But yeah, so I'll now hand over to Dan Hill. As I said, is currently a director of Melbourne School of Design, and previously at Vinnova in Sweden and many other places in Helsinki and all over the place. So a very experienced strategic designer and thinker in the space of policy design and policy implementation. So Dan, floor is yours.
Thanks, Rainer. Thank you very much. I may be very experienced, but I'm not sure. I've never pressed the take control button in Teams. I'm tempted to do it and see if it lets me click through my slides. Does it do that? Does anybody know?
It should let you, yeah, but who knows?
Let's see what happens. So Anna, do I? There we go. Can I do anything? No.
Does it not allow you? I mean, otherwise I'm happy to click through, so I can take us through, but maybe try if you can do it. It might let you, but I think perhaps Teams forbids it.
I'll just press on. If you can, I'll tell you. I'll give you the shout, Anna, when it's next.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, maybe a placebo button, as it says in the chat, and I'm not the only placebo in my life, I'm sure. So thank you, Rainer, and thanks for that great introduction, Anna. And yeah, I'm at the University of Melbourne in Australia. I'm a professor of the built environment there. Previously, as Rainer says, I worked for Vinnova. I was the director of strategic design. Vinnova, for those that you don't know, and I guess that may be most of you, is the Swedish government's innovation agency. So in the national government in Sweden, one of the agencies there. And we produced this playbook, which you see the cover of on screen. It's a free PDF download courtesy of the Swedish taxpayer. So go and take advantage of their largesse. You can Google it and find it. It's a hefty thing. It's about like 500 pages or something. And I'll explain why it was so big in a bit. But partly it was also to try to get Vinnova to produce a book, actually, to leave a trace of the work so that others could follow it. And that's why it's quite so large. It goes into a bit of detail as to the context of Sweden, the context of missions in Europe. It's critical of some of those things. And of course, it looks to build on some of Sweden's traditions and particular cultures as well. So it needed a bit of context as well as some tools. But really, it's ultimately a story of making missions happen on the ground. And I guess maybe 2 to 3 years of work there in Sweden, starting from nothing and getting to some missions which are still rolling and actually rolling at national scale. So I think they're probably one of the examples of missions that has been rolled out or created from a blank page all the way through to some degree. It's not finished because missions never are, which is one of my distinctions, I guess, with the mission framework that Mariana and others have created. I don't think that there are targets that we achieve in this way, but more like using that as a guide to continued innovation over time. But I'll come to that. So maybe next slide, please, Anna, and then we'll get into it. I'll try and move quickly. So one of the first critical things we wanted to do, of course, was to look at this idea of missions as moonshots, essentially. And of course, in the Swedish context of a relatively well-equipped public sector, there's a very strong appetite for a powerful public-private third sector mission framework that works really well in Sweden in lots of ways. There's 100 years worth of tradition of that kind of nation-building collaborative effort from the late 1920s onwards, which you can work with. But equally, pointing to Richard Nelson's book from 1978 or 79, I think earlier, at the same time, and saying that actually getting to the moon is relatively easy. In a sense, it's a technical challenge, and maybe it's a hard technical challenge, but in that sense, it's not as tough as trying to fix the ghetto in the language of the 1970s. And this is something that's been pointed out many, many times. It's much harder to try and come up with an affordable housing framework within a convivial, healthy neighborhood. We don't have that many examples of those things. We've been to the moon multiple times, right? And going to the moon doesn't really ask all Americans to change their everyday habits and lifestyles. Whereas the more complex social missions involve exactly that kind of process. So we wanted to put that out there right away. So there's context about that in the book too, just to balance the idea that these are traditional R&D tools. I don't think they are in that sense. So next slide, please, Anna. But as I said, there is a tradition here in Sweden of things that were a bit like missions before that. So the seat belt in cars comes from Vattenfall, the Swedish energy company. It was a nationally owned company, triggering R&D with Volvo and other things in order to stop people dying in huge numbers in cars. Partly their employees were dying, so it was a very self-serving mission in a way. But then, of course, it has an immense impact across the world. The three-point seatbelt is invented in that way in the 1940s and 50s, coming directly from that kind of public sector innovation, working with private sector. The Miljon program housing in Sweden in the 1960s through to the 1970s was precisely a mission in a way before the word was really invented. There's a very clear target. We're going to make 1 million affordable dwellings for people of an average wage that could afford to live there by 1975. And they said that in 1965, and they achieved 1,064,000 homes by about 1974. No country can do this now, apparently, by the way, which is extraordinary. So New Zealand tried to do 100,000 a few years ago and gave up and said it's impossible. But somehow Sweden did 1 million in the 60s. So it sort of makes you think about why things have changed since then. So a large part of the book also begins to explore why we can't also easily move in these ways that we could in, say, the 60s and 70s. Things are more complex now. So next slide, please, Anna. So what we tried to do is then say, let's test this in practice. So we took Mariana's, or rather IIPP's, I guess, but Mariana originally, the structure on the left-hand side, which has a grand challenge framed as a mission, a bunch of sectors aligned around that, and then a portfolio of projects heading in that direction. Super good, right? But that's a structural diagram. It doesn't really give you a sense of a process there. Like, how do you actually do that? So in a way, what we did was turn that on its side, almost like rotate it through 90 degrees, if you like, to then spread it out over time and say we need to start with a challenge, and we can co-produce that, co-design it, using actors and system actors in those sectors. And that leads us to projects one way or another. So that's where you get this kind of mission diagram on its side there, because we're literally turning it into a timeline, running it horizontally as opposed to vertically, which is a structural diagram. So if you go to the next slide, you see that turns into something that looks like this. We start looking at the angles within a question. So the question might be healthy, sustainable mobility or healthy, sustainable food systems. Those were the two that we chose to prototype. And we do that in collaboration, as you'll see in a moment. Out of that, we find some missions through a very participative process. In doing it that way, you're building a network of people that actually are on board to do missions as they go. And then from that, you're building prototypes and then ultimately expanding those into demonstrators. Next slide, please. So it sounds easy, and of course it's not. But we chose these two areas to begin with for various reasons. They're nationally important in Sweden in different ways. They're nationally important in most countries, these areas. We're not approaching these as sectors, although they do include industries and other things within them. But you'll also see that they have an everyday component to them. People move around and people eat every single day in different ways. And so it's something that we can start to engage much wider systems around, not just thinking about an industry here, but also the patterns of everyday life. And they're full of culture and society and politics as much as they're full of technology and resources. Next slide, please. So we did this kind of series of workshops. We got through about 500 different organizations as the innovation agency. So I had a small team there, really, only about 4 or 5 people, maybe 5 or 6, and then an organization behind it. Vinnova is about 200 people, and we fund R&D and innovation in the country. So there's some financial resource there, but actually very little finance was used to do this. This was more a case of calling people up and saying, would you be part of these workshops that we're figuring out the future of mobility in Sweden? And actually people say yes to that in Sweden where they can. And what we're doing here is stakeholders, really. These aren't people working as citizens, if you like. Of course, they are citizens, or people in Sweden anyway, but they are representing private sector, public sector, third sector, but all at the same time in the room together. So collaborative workshops. We might have people from a municipality, we might have people from Volvo trucks, we might have people from a bicycle lobby group, all at the same time, working together on asking, where should we start with the mission? What might a mission be here, really? Very open questions. Next, Anna. Thanks. From that, we can begin to drill down. And we get these kind of messy systems canvases out of this stuff. So these are really messy, I can tell you, but they're full of possibility. And what we're trying to do here is going to keep it holistic. It's not just a supply side less story of if we change this technology, then this will change, but actually looking at the demand side around mobility and food as well. We're looking at questions, not answers yet. So we don't want solutions here. We're just looking for the starting point. And yes, there are technologies in there, but it's very different to a traditional R&D program in that sense. We're trying to look at that stuff critically as well. What if we drove less? What if we had fewer cars on the roads? What if demand was reduced for this in some way? How could that happen? Those were also valid questions, along with complex political stuff. Next, Anna, please. And out of that, for instance, came a very straightforward mission, a bit like the moon landing one, as in just a technical mission. Let's get all the heavy trucks in Sweden and turn them from diesel to electric. So that one's rolling. That's easy. That's Volvo and Scania, basically big companies like that. It's about 40% of trucks in the world turning their engines to electric. So not a hard one, but a thing to be done. So that came out straight away. Next, please, Anna. The more complex one is ensuring every street in Sweden is healthy, sustainable, and full of life. And that's really interesting because you're not looking at the mobility technology as the goal there, but actually the context of mobility. Where does mobility happen? Where do mobility systems collide and coincide? Well, it's places like streets. That's the tangle of activities that actually most cities have to deal with, of course. So it's also clearly full of culture and politics and social questions as well as technical questions and complex trade-offs and political mutually exclusive uses, all of those things. And multiple layers of governance, all 3 levels of government in Sweden are implicated in streets, as are private sector and community. So next slide, please. Finding these everyday environments is really important. Then we go further, deeper into those things. So now we've got a street on the table. So the real mission, the one I just talked about before, the other electric truck mission, that's rolling in parallel to this one. This one is looking more at the context of mobility, like I said, more about streets. So here we have someone from, on the right-hand side, Voi, they're the biggest micro-mobility company in the Nordics and in Europe, I think. You also have someone from Ericsson R&D there, but you also have a municipal transport planner, you've got a health researcher, and you see they're scribbling together potential changes within a street environment. It's very tangible, very clear, and they're working together on that. Everybody's pen is on the table, right? Next slide. Out of that come kind of questions as to what might be the future of these things. So we would use speculative narratives here just to put them in front of people to sort of conjure up a different idea of streets. And these are just to trigger questions in people's minds again. And what we would do is always leave these blank at the end and we let the people in the workshop finish them off. They could critique the story, they could change the story, they could add something else to it, whatever. But this also begins to kind of unlock a sense of possibility. Next slide, please, Anna. And what we're doing then is reframing this as a design technique, you know, and it's kind of helping people understand a street is just our biggest public space, right? It can do lots of things. It's not about traffic, actually. If you look at a street from 1800, 1700, 1600, you know, in Sweden, streets have been around for at least, let's say, 600, 700 years. Very rarely are they about traffic. They're about culture, about exchange, about politics, about everyday life. And of course, traffic is within that, but it's not the point, actually. So we've made this mistake of, let's say, giving the street to the traffic department. And if, like in the left-hand side of the diagram there, if you give the street to the traffic department, you get traffic. The clue is in the name. If you give the street to gardeners, you'd get gardens. So whoever is governing the thing and their own metrics and organizational cultures reinforces what plays out there. So what we're trying to do, like on the right-hand side, is open up the sense of possibility within the system there. You can also use the street to increase public health, increase biodiversity, reduce carbon, reduce crime, increase cultural exchange, as well as move things around. All of those things are possible. So they need to be inputs into the process. So we're kind of opening up the idea of what a street is. Next slide, please. This is all mission framing, by the way. So this is happening over the course of some months, all of these workshops. So out of that come these kind of diagrams coming from those workshops. They give a sense of sort of potential ideas, starting points, technologies, etc. You can see already, though, there's a mixture of things there. It's not just drones and autonomous shuttles. It's also trees and you know, small businesses. So there's lots of different things happening here simultaneously. Next slide, please. So we then did similar workshops at all levels, by the way. So that guy on the left-hand side is the former Swedish Prime Minister. He was the Swedish Prime Minister when we were running these processes. So he's doing the same workshop with him. And the person next to him is the Health Minister. This was in 2019, so just before COVID, before they got distracted, as we all did. But we're doing that same kind of process of what could a street be about? What are the particular patterns that could play here? So you can do this at the prime ministerial level. You're not looking for sign off, in my view, at this point, by the way. It's still just getting his view on it as a stakeholder in the system. That's all. So next slide, please. The other thing is that prime ministers are not great at that kind of thing. So they have other qualities. So then what we need to do is bring it down to the ground and start testing it. So we found 4 streets in Stockholm. We worked with the city and said, could you give us 4 streets to prototype on? So these are those streets. Next slide, please. They'll have schools on them. So what we did was the real design work we did with the school kids on those streets. Now, these people are the experts in the street, actually. These 6-year-olds go there every single day. They know what the street needs around their school anyway, at least. Far more than the Prime Minister does, who is living literally in another town, and certainly more than the transport planner who is 5 kilometers away in town hall, probably never been to those streets. So these people are the ones doing the actual design work as to what a street could be. We gave them some kit, of course. Next slide, please, Anna. And what comes out of that are these drawings, which are lovely and full of possibility. I mean, kids are very good designers, actually. They're very sensible. You'll see there's cafes and seats there because kids know that you need that too. But you also see swing sets and playgrounds and fake palm trees and things like that. Next slide, please. So we're using these as inputs then into saying, well, how do we make that scale across a whole country? We want to transform every street in this way. And when we can start looking at the common patterns there, every street has parking space on it. Every parking space is basically the same because it all has to fit a Volvo 340 in it or something. So they're all a very consistent pattern and they're all run by national laws there. But each application in that street can be decided by the street. So you have a base layer, which is the kind of platform, if you like, the operating system, a bit like iOS or Android on a phone. And then you have the applications, as in you all have iOS and Android phones, probably. Maybe there's a couple of others there, but most of you will have those phones. But all of your applications are different, okay? Some we have in common, like bike sharing spots, but others will be different, like a barbecue. You know, Reiner Street might have barbecues on it, mine might have trees on it, right? So you let the street decide the application, but the consistent layer can scale across the whole country. Lots of detail on prototyping in the book and these kind of patterns of platform thinking versus application thinking. Next slide, please. This enables something to spread, though, and so what they start to, these are what happened in Stockholm, the first set of prototypes. You'll see they're made of wood. So this is deliberately using circular materials. It's also deliberately having a sense of care and maintenance folded into them, and wood enables things to change as well. So every 2 years you go back, because 2 Swedish winters, these things won't last that long. So every 2 years you have to go back and ask, well, what is the street about now? 5 years ago, we didn't have e-scooters, now we do. So we need to make e-scooter parking. It has that kind of clock speed built into it. This is why I say missions never finish, actually, because in real life, places never finish, systems never finish. Next slide, please. So it becomes a platform for continual iteration. This is in Gothenburg. It was in Helsingborg, and then Umeå and beyond. So keep going, Anna. Thank you. Next slide. We worked with Volvo Cars on this, which was kind of interesting as well. And you could see that when you're looking at a street like this, actually the CEO of Volvo started saying that our goal now is actually to reduce the number of cars in cities. And I've worked on many projects globally where now car companies are beginning to realize that we need to reduce the number. So maybe Volvo is a little bit different, and maybe Håkan wouldn't say exactly that in another country, but it's clear that this is a different age now. And that street on the right is an old idea now, not a new idea, not even a current idea. We need to move away from this. So this process enables us to start that happening. Next slide, please, Anna. We also worked with the artist and musician Brian Eno on some design principles there, and I won't go into these in detail again, they're all in the book, but this is also rebalancing about saying who can be involved in the discussion. So an artist and musician, someone like Eno in particular, who understands systems, he has as much to contribute to the idea of a street as a 6-year-old or a traffic planner. Okay, so we're just sort of saying whose voices could help open up new ways of thinking. Next slide, please. And then what we're trying to do is start this process rolling. So this is then the starting point, a street like this. Next slide, please, Anna. And we're taking the first step forward, like a half step into the future, just to get something going. And now we're in a discussion with citizens, with car companies, municipalities, national transport agencies. Next slide, please, Anna. We're speculating about all this stuff. Obviously, maybe it goes here next. That's another step and so on. So that's now we've actually got the ball moving up the pitch, if you like, in a football analogy. We've got the ball moving forward in a way that currently the systems are often stuck. Next one, please. And this is really important, the theory of change here. So don't bother about reading these quotes. All they really say is we can't just figure these things out as scientific solutions and then just email everybody and say, would you mind giving up your car, please? Because that's not helpful for the environment right now. You know, it's just not going to happen like that. We don't have that kind of culture. So sometimes the science or the data just doesn't work. Good policy might equal bad politics, and that's really problematic. We still need to change things. So how do we do that? And this comes then down to prototyping on the ground these technologies in public, in real life, that they become socio-technical challenges, not just technical challenges. Next slide, please. So this is a platform for asking questions, actually, and those questions might be, how do we organize Amazon deliveries better using machine learning at curbside? Or they could be, how do we live alongside increased biodiversity in the street? Next slide, please. And so the results started coming back from the first prototypes. We started getting like 74% positive about how did people feel about the streets. This is with car parking taken away. And when I say taken away, I mean voluntarily, as in people given the choice said, you know what, we'd prefer trees and social space and other things like that, as opposed to the car parking, given the choice. And you realize that actually we don't often give people the choice as to design their street. I certainly have never been given that choice, and I'm an urban designer, right? I guess most of you have not been asked what you'd like your street to be. We also saw a 400% increase in activity on the street. Lots of interesting side effects of that. Very positive, actually. Next slide, please. So the other really important thing is we started looking at the value that this generates. And sorry for this small writing, but just for example, those very small, simple interventions start producing value across multiple different measures. Usually when you're thinking about streets, the measures are things like number of cars per hour minus number of deaths per year, things like this. They might be a few sort of, we need to reduce carbon dioxide and so on. But for example, if you reduce traffic noise, you increase diversity of birdsong. You increase birdsong in total and diversity usually. If people hear diversity of birdsong, their mental health improves, they recover from sickness quicker, And actually, a study on 26,000 German people found that birdsong increased people's life satisfaction more than a 15% increase in their salary, just hearing more birds. So there are all of these other factors that start unlocking it, and birdsong is inversely proportional to traffic noise. If you put traffic noise up, birdsong goes down, right? And people feel actually unhappier. I can tell you though, those metrics are never being used by transport planners in Hamburg or London or Marseille. They're just, or Mexico City. There's loads of other types of value there. All of these little white bits are bits of research that exist already. All the research has been done on this stuff. We're not bringing it together coherently, systemically in these kind of change processes. So this platform, very simple thing, was a way of flooding through, thinking about what is the value of these systems, and all of that stuff begins to move, again, the ball rolling. You start creating a mission through a movement technique. Next slide, please, Anna. I'm nearly finished. So we actually have multiple angles there. In my mission portfolio sort of diagram here, you have this kind of North Star in the middle, that kind of star-like thing, which is every street in Sweden is healthy, sustainable, full of life. What I've talked to you about is one mission project there called Street Moves. And they are complemented by numerous other missions there: micromobility policy labs, citizen participation tools. The value model is a separate project again, the one I just talked about, and so on. They're all oriented around this North Star, though, as you can see, and it's complemented by some of those other missions I talked about earlier. Next slide, please, Anna. And behind this is then a platform strategy which talks about all of the different system actors engaged in this. On the right-hand side, you see all of these different collaborators at different levels here. Many people actually across public, private, and third sector. And then those different layers of platform on the left-hand side, the blue bits are the scaling layers. They're the things that enable you to scale or spread things: policy, law, financing, etc. The green bit at the top is the particular project in the street. Next slide, please, Anna. And then it spreads globally, and we started calling it the 1 Minute City. Next slide, please. And this is part of then the momentum behind it. It was in the New York Times and the Guardian and Bloomberg and all of those things, and Forbes and so on. All of this actually is a technique for spreading. So it's actually part of the process of the mission. How do you use publicity to keep the thing moving? Next slide, please. So now it's around 25 different municipalities. I'm long gone from this mission, as you can tell. I'm sitting here in Australia, but it's still rolling, and that's really interesting in a way, because it's now rolling as almost by itself to some degree, and it's now spread to Normandy, and next it's going to heading to San Jose, I think, courtesy of Vinnova again. It's beginning to move the same kind of technique as a sort of lateral social movement, which I find is a much better way of doing it than a traditional mission process. A top-down measure, let me say. So next slide, I think I'm nearly there, and then I'll stop. That's the website where you can find out about it. That's also part of the process, obviously, cultivating it. Next one, please, Anna. And the next one. So there we go. So the book also has a school food mission. I'm not going to go into that. So what we've tried to do with the missions is take a systemic approach using these everyday environments, school food and streets in this case. And in streets, you can begin to talk about public health, climate footprint, social justice, micromobility startups, all of those things through that simple process I described, or rather simple idea. And it takes a bit of effort. It took about 1.5 years or so. But now you can see, again, up to 25 different cities using it across 3 different chunks of the world now, and so it's kind of spreading by itself a bit, as well as changing practices in the government and involved, as I said, like Voi micromobility, Volvo Cars, many other major players on the industry side as well. So I won't go into any. I'll stop there, Anna, because I know I'm a bit over. You can skip through these. They're all in the.
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much, Dan. For this excellent overview of the work done in Vinnova and by Vinnova, and I think it's a very interesting take on missions where the innovation agency becomes this sort of originator of a movement that then sort of has this ripple effects through the system. And I think we can come back to that later, or maybe another time even, around like the capabilities you had to build in an agency to do that as well, which is in itself a really interesting process. And there are a couple of questions and comments for you in the chat, so you can take a look. And I'll open up the floor after Ralf's presentation as well. So we have two presentations. So next one is Ralf Lindner, who heads up the Competence Center for Policy and Society at Fraunhofer Institute. And if you're interested in their work, they have I think a special line of work around mission-oriented policies. So I definitely can highly recommend their studies around that. They're very valuable, very interesting. So if you're interested in more of their work, please have a look. But Ralf, the floor is yours now.
All right, yeah. So thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm really excited to speak to this group. I'm fascinated by all the different backgrounds that I just briefly saw in the chat when some of you introduced themselves, which is really great. Just briefly. To place or put some of the stuff I'll talk about in context. This work that I'll present today is kind of the result of a longer project we had the privilege to conduct on behalf of the German Federal Ministry for Research and Education. And they were in charge of basically designing and implementing the national innovation strategy, which was always had a kind of strange name of the high-tech strategy. It was not so much about high-tech, but that's kind of the way they call it anyways. And this last version of this national strategy also, for the first time in Germany at least, defined 12 different missions. And we were able to kind of conduct a scientific support action for these missions. And I would argue those about 3.5 years working with the ministry and this implementation process really helped us to learn a lot about at least how things work and particularly don't work in the German context. And one element of this support action was also to come up with a framework for impact assessment of mission-oriented innovation policies. And that's what I'll give a brief overview of this framework. So it's basically zooming into a particular element of the many things you could think of and deal with when we talk about mission-oriented innovation policies. We, as Rainer already mentioned, part of the project or the outputs of the project are manifold. For instance, we also produced a policy brief which covers, I would say, like all the phases of mission policy. And I would argue many of the things Dan just so nicely described pop up there again, of course, in a specific framing, because this was a government-led strategy, and it became quite apparent to me when I listened to Dan. Things work quite differently in Sweden, and if I may add, seems to work much better than in the German context, definitely. So there's lots to learn from the Swedish case, but nonetheless, we have to cope with the things as they are here in our context. And Lina also said, yes, it's right. We produced or developed this framework in the context of this German case, but we do hope that the toolbox I'll present right now is also applicable to other contexts, because it is flexible and modular in its approach. So we do hope, at least that was our ambition, we do hope to have produced something that is applicable beyond the German case. Before I start, I'll be presenting this, but of course this is not a one-person show. So a lot of credit for this work goes to my colleagues Florian Wittmann, Florian Roth, and Miriam Hufnagel, who were part of the core team in this project. So now I'll try to change the slide. Let's see if it works. Doesn't. So Anna, if you can you be so kind and oh yeah, all right, perfect. So that's good. I'll keep this one brief because I guess most of you have already a very well developed understanding of mission-oriented innovation policies. I maybe just to drop a few words on how we understand missions. For us, it is extremely important to be sure that when we talk about missions, we actually mean missions that have the ambition to foster transformative change, because we also see empirically that there are a lot of policies out there calling themselves missions, but actually, if you look at them closer, they are actually not really transformative. So this is one of the things we really want to stress. And if you're serious about this transformative element, we do think it is important to span all the relevant stages of the innovation cycle. It is important to have a broad policy mix that usually reaches beyond the core of research innovation policies. So you're also addressing a lot of sectoral policies, be it mobility, be it food, whatever. And that is another key characteristic for us, that you do cut across different policy fields, sectors, and disciplines, typically when you talk about transformative missions. Also, when we talk about the part of measuring the success of missions, so all this debate about impact assessment, I would argue we are all pretty much at the beginning with coming up with useful tools and approaches in this area, because there are a lot of challenges related to this. Once you actually dive into it, it is, for one part, extremely difficult to deal with these long time horizons that many missions actually have. So, we're not looking at time spans of just 3 or 4 years, but actually more in the direction of 15 to 20 years. Or, as Dan said, actually missions might never be over. So however you frame it, you do have to deal with these time spans. And then empirically, if you look at all the missions and the mission approaches that are out there, they're really, really diverse. So it's I would argue it doesn't make sense to come up with a one-fits-all approach. So you have to deal with this heterogeneity of all the different missions out there. Kind of an objective that we put on our own table when we developed this framework was actually we want to have a tool that helps to compare intended effects of a mission, but also the actual progress of missions. So to tap into that area, and also something that helps mission owners. So mission owners are those basically in charge of setting up a mission and also kind of steering and governing these missions. Typically governments, but doesn't have to be that way. But in most cases, at least to my observation, it is mainly governments driving these missions. So actually to support these mission owners in bringing these missions into actions, but also helping external evaluators to have a kind of a critical look on what is happening in these mission implementation processes and how can we assess them. Anna, please, then the next one. So this brings me to kind of the key requirements we see for assessing the impact of mission-oriented innovation policies. First of all, I think it is really important to have a strong formative perspective when we approach these things. I also would argue this is pretty much in line with the current academic debate we have in the evaluation field and impact assessment field, particularly because of this very dynamic and in many cases also experimental character of missions. It is important to have formative, so learning supporting elements in these approaches. Already mentioned the integrated perspective of missions, covering all phases from mission formulation, design, and implementation. So ideally, such a concept would cover all those. And a theory-based approach also seems extremely important and useful, particularly because of these long time horizons we're looking at. And as a kind of a way out of the diversity of missions that we are looking at in real life, is it would be great to have something that is quite flexible and modular. So depending on the mission and the concrete context a mission owner is facing, the toolbox then can be applied in very different ways. All right, Anna, please, the next one. So yes, this gives us a kind of an overview of the toolbox in a kind of a simple graphical overview. So on the left side, you kind of see 5 of the 6 key toolbox elements. Now, before I look or explain each of them, there's kind of an important starting point, an important conceptualization, which is kind of in the background of much of our thinking here, drawing on the insights of policy analysis, which basically found out that in the process of implementing policy, there are translation processes going on. And between the phase of when you actually formulate a policy and the phase of actually implementing policy, you in many cases will see, well, that what was originally intended does not actually happen when we're in the actual implementation process. And you can explain that actually quite well, because in the translation from policy formulation to policy implementation, this translation kind of certain things get lost and don't play out the way that they were originally intended. And so this thinking guided us to a certain extent in our project, because that is exactly what we observed. We saw that when the policymakers thought about a certain societal challenge and kind of translated that into a mission, formulate a mission out of this challenge, certain things got lost. The same happened then again after the mission was formulated, when the actual design process started. Here again, many things that the policymakers were intending did not really show up in the mission design, and likewise in the actual implementation phase. So we thought, well, it makes a lot of sense to look at closer at these translation processes, because the dynamics that happen there, the actors that are involved in each of these translation steps, that does make a difference, particularly also with regard to the potential impacts such an mission-oriented policy can unfold. So having said that, let's look at the left side of the chart. You see the first translation step, the mission formulation. And here we have 2 elements of the toolkit. One is the analysis of the socio-technical system. And the second one is kind of also clarifying how ambitious should my mission be. Also, that is something to be clarified early on in the mission process. The second analytical step in this is the mission design process, and here much of the mechanics of mission design become important. We worked with the concept of impact pathways that can be developed for each of the missions, and also kind of an instrument portfolio approach to ensure that the things that are part of the mission goal are actually underlined with appropriate policy interventions. And the final step is then the mission implementation, which has a lot to do with actually defining appropriate indicators. I'll say a few more words about each of these 5 elements. On the right side, you will see a kind of 3 overarching questions, and each of the 3 questions they refer to the 3 translation steps. So the first question related to the mission formulation is, does the mission formulation actually provide the guidance for mission design and goal achievement? So this is something that those involved in the mission design process, mission formulation process, should ask themselves. our toolbox differentiated below these three key questions, over 140 questions that can be asked to each of these translation steps. This would be something not so much for the actual mission owner, but this could be something of interest for instance, external evaluators. They could use this catalog of 140 plus questions to better understand how these different translation steps played out and how they shaped and maybe also even constrained the potential impacts of the mission at hand. All right, Anna, the next one, please. I'm hoping I'm not using too much of the time. Rainer and Anna, just wave at me if I should speed up.
If you have like 5 more minutes or so, around 5-7 minutes, let's say.
All right, I should be able to handle that. So this is an overview of all the toolbox elements, all 6 of them. So the left side bottom corner, this is this relates to the formulation phase. This is a toolbox element that we thought it could be extremely helpful at the very beginning of the mission design mission formulation process, because this is basically a systems mapping exercise. It reminded me a lot of the things that Dan referred to. This is also kind of to be conducted in different settings, but ideally a kind of a workshop setting with all relevant stakeholders. And here, this is a kind of an information gathering exercise. So what are the key actors? What are the key policies in a socio-technical system that needs to be transformed by the mission? What are the substantial problems that this socio-technical system faces, and so forth? So it provides information for the further steps in the mission formulation process, but also has a kind of aligning function, because those involved hopefully will kind of come up with a shared understanding of what is the actual socio-technical system we're talking about, what are the boundaries of the system, and what might be the scope of the mission we want to formulate. The second toolbox element is also still located in this formulation process, and we kind of learned from the exchanges with policymakers that there are very different understandings and sometimes also very different possibilities on the side of the mission owners and policymakers, how ambitious they can actually be with their missions. So clarifying this is also an important step at this early stage of mission formulation. And we suggest to use a typology that we once developed. It has also been published, where you can basically look at the different requirements and also prospects of these different types of missions. And whatever the situation is for those involved in the mission formulation process, they then can maybe make a more deliberate decision in which direction to go and how far-reaching their mission can be. And sometimes it probably doesn't make sense to be extremely ambitious when you already know that you don't have the means to actually organize such a mission, such a very, very far-reaching, very transformative mission. The next translation step then is the one that could you please? Yeah, thank you. That's the one that refers more to the actual design of a mission. So that's this very much about the policy tools. And here we suggest to work with the concept of impact pathways. To support policymakers or the mission owners with designing their specific and those impact pathways that really fit their certain case, their certain mission. We came up with 11 stylized impact pathways, very generic, and they could kind of serve as a template. And then they could look at their specific situation and then decide, okay, so do we need maybe an impact pathway that stresses, for instance, scientific research? Do we need an impact pathway that stresses innovation? Do we need an impact pathway that stresses changes of individual behavior? So this could be a useful tool, we hope, using these 11 stylized impact pathways, and then in a kind of a workshop setting, ideally, those designing the mission then could get together and think about, okay, how can we build impact pathways that are, most likely to reach the intended impacts. Likewise, and this is kind of the picture in the middle, the inventory of instruments and impact pathways. Once you have your impact pathways, then you can take the next step and think about, okay, what are the appropriate policy instruments, tools, interventions that will actually do the job. This is also something the toolbox contains. It's a kind of a template where you can actually, first of all, start, well, what policies have been actually implemented already in this field. This is, by the way, something that we thought was necessary, because when we were studying the German case, we talked to several ministries involved in the missions. And actually, if we thought that this is a simple question. So which policies are actually in place, and which policies do you consider are part of this mission? And nobody really could give us a conclusive answer. And we thought this is kind of embarrassing. If you have mission teams that are supposed to run a mission and they don't even know which policies are part of a mission or not, then maybe it would be important to clarify that at a certain point. So that's one of the stories behind this toolbox element. And the final, more procedural toolbox element is the one with the little bubble, management or mission implementation. This is something where a lot of actually indicator work will have to be done. And this is also the part of the toolbox that is least developed, because each of the missions are so different. So we weren't able to come up with a kind of a core set of indicators that can be used in each and every case. But we do think that based on the impact pathways and the portfolio of instruments that have been developed in the design phase, they then can be used as a starting point to actually develop fitting indicators. And to support these processes, we also kind of came up with an example set of indicators from a certain mission. In our case, it was the combating cancer mission, where we came up with what we thought useful indicators to kind of track the progress of that mission. And the final picture on the right side, that's this something that is probably more useful for external evaluators. This is the catalog of the 140 plus questions, which kind of gives you a more overview of the situation of the mission as a whole. All right, Anna. So the next one, I think that will skip due to time reasons, and then I'm basically already coming to an end. I'll just maybe to summarize it this way, I think what our toolbox is trying to achieve is first of all is supporting the mission owners in their actual work, because we did notice that there is a lot of need to provide concrete support in designing and implementing missions. I think it is at least for us, it was extremely helpful to unbox the high complexity of missions by thinking or understanding them as multiple translation processes. Of course, this is an analytical step. In reality, things are much more intertwined, no doubt, but at least analytically, we thought it was helpful. And maybe it's also helpful for policymakers to kind of think of missions that way. And of course, there are many open questions in this whole game. One of the things that seems to be a huge bottleneck in all these implementation processes is the lack of capacities on the side of the mission owners, typically ministries. They normally do not have the person power to do all the things that our toolbox is actually asking for. So this is the one thing, but it's not only an issue of person power, it's also in many cases an issue of the lack of the appropriate resources and also competencies to do all these complex and demanding things that are in our perspective necessary to roll out successful missions. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. I hope it wasn't too long.
No, thanks so much, Ralf, for this excellent presentation. And indeed, as we see, a different context necessitates different kind of thinking about mission-oriented policies in terms of what tools would be helpful. And I think it is very interesting that that your work around the tools is opening up more questions, perhaps for the German context, and gives answers. It gives some of the answers, but also shows the blind spots. So we can see that these kind of toolkits, toolbox, they play a kind of different function in a different systems.